I moved every dollar of my multi-million-dollar inheritance into a trust exactly 1 week before my wedding. I told myself I was just being careful. I didn't know how right I was because the very next morning I woke up to the sound of my own parents and my sister standing in the kitchen whispering about how they were going to get their hands on my money once I said, "I do." My name is Emily Carter. I'm 29 years old, an Army captain, and until that morning I thought I understood my family. I was wrong about almost everything. I grew up in a modest house outside Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of place where the porch light stayed on past midnight, and dinner was always at 6. My father Richard worked in logistics his whole life, steady, proud, the kind of man who believed a family should function like a chain of command with him at the top. My mother Linda ran the household with a soft voice and a harder set of rules underneath it. And then there was Ashley, my older sister by 5 years, the golden child before I even knew what that phrase meant. I was the quiet one, the one who joined the Army at 18 instead of going to the state school 40 minutes from home. The one who learned to make her bed with hospital corners and speak in clipped, efficient sentences. I didn't resent my family for favoring Ashley, not really. I just learned early how to need less from them. The money came from my grandparents on my mother's side. My grandfather built a small chain of hardware stores across 3 states, and by the time he passed quietly in his sleep at 86, that chain had become something much larger. My grandmother followed him 2 years later. I was the only grandchild who'd spent summers with them, who'd sat on their back porch, shelling peas and listening to my grandfather talk about integrity, like it was a tool you had to sharpen every day. So when the will was read, I was the one who inherited nearly all of it. Multi-millions in cash, property, and stock. I never told my family the real number. They knew I'd gotten something. That was the phrase Ashley used at Thanksgiving, rolling her eyes just slightly. Emily got something from Grandma and Grandpa. I let them believe it was modest, a cushion, nothing that would change how they saw me. Then I met Daniel. Daniel Brooks was an engineer, the kind of man who fixed things quietly instead of announcing that he'd fixed them. We met at a friend's barbecue 2 years ago, and within 6 months I knew I wanted to marry him. He didn't know about the money, not the real scope of it. I'd never lied to him. I just never had a reason to bring it up, and some part of me, the part trained by years of watching people change the moment they smelled wealth, wanted to know he loved me before he loved my bank account. As the wedding approached, something shifted in my family. My mother started calling every day, her voice syrupy with affection I hadn't heard since I was small. My father wanted to help with the planning, which was new. He'd never once asked about my life in any real detail before. Ashley, who'd barely spoken to me in the 2 years since her divorce, suddenly wanted to be my maid of honor. She sent flower arrangement ideas. She sent a text that said, "We're going to be so close after this. I can feel it." I should have been happy. Instead, I felt a small, cold pressure building behind my sternum, the kind of feeling I used to get in the field right before something went wrong. A friend of mine, a lawyer named Patricia, who I'd served with years earlier, took me to lunch one Tuesday and told me something I never forgot. She said, stirring her coffee without looking up, "Inheritance changes people, Emily. Not the person who has it, the people around them." I laughed it off at the time. But that night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the flower arrangements Ashley sent, about my father's sudden interest in the numbers, about my mother asking almost casually whether Daniel and I had talked about finances yet. So 1 week before the wedding, without telling anyone, not my parents, not Ashley, not even Daniel, I met with an estate attorney and moved every asset I owned into an irrevocable trust. Sole beneficiary me. No joint accounts, no shared ownership, no exceptions. It took 4 hours, 3 signatures, and 1 long look in the mirror afterward, wondering if I was being paranoid or finally being smart. I told myself it was just a precaution, a quiet formality. I didn't expect to need it so soon. The next morning I woke up early before my alarm, the way I always do, old habit from years of 5 a.m. formations. The house was still dark. I padded downstairs in bare feet for water, and that's when I heard voices in the kitchen. My father's voice low and deliberate, my mother's softer urging, and Ashley's sharp with impatience. I stopped in the hallway, my hand against the cool wall, and listened. "Once they're married, Daniel's going to have to sign something," my father was saying. "That's how we get access. Community property or whatever they call it. She won't just hand it over, my mother said. You know how she is. She doesn't have to hand anything over, Ashley snapped. She just has to be told what family means. I stood frozen in that hallway in my own childhood home, listening to the three people who were supposed to love me unconditionally plan how to take what wasn't theirs. And in that moment, something inside me went very, very still, the same stillness I remembered from every difficult decision I'd ever made under pressure. I didn't walk into that kitchen, not yet. I just closed my eyes, breathed once, and thought, thank God I moved it when I did. I stood in that hallway for a long moment, the tile cold under my feet, my heart beat loud in my own ears. I didn't move. I didn't confront them. 12 years in the army teaches you that the person who reacts first is usually the person who loses the advantage. And some old disciplined part of my brain took over even as the rest of me wanted to walk into that kitchen and demand an explanation. Instead, I listened. She's not going to just fork it over, my mother was saying, her voice pitched low, almost gentle, like she was talking someone down from a ledge instead of talking about her own daughter. Emily's careful. You know that about her. That's why we do it after the wedding, my father said. There was a calm procedural quality to his voice, the same tone he used when he talked about supply chains and quarterly logistics reports. Once Daniel's her husband, there are legal structures. Community property laws vary by state, but there are ways to make sure the family benefits from what she has. We just need her to trust the process. Ashley's laugh was short and humorless. She doesn't need to trust anything. She just needs to understand that we've always been here for her. Family helps family. She forgets that sometimes off playing soldier. I remember pressing my palm flat against the wall, feeling the texture of the paint under my fingers, grounding myself the way I'd been trained to during moments of high stress. Playing soldier. I'd spent a decade of my life in uniform, missed birthdays and holidays, and my own grandmother's final months because of deployments, and my sister reduced it to a hobby in the same breath she was scheming to take my money. The strangest part wasn't the anger, it was the clarity. Standing there, I understood all at once that this wasn't a new development. This wasn't a betrayal that started last week. This was simply a truth I hadn't let myself see, before a truth that had probably always been there, patient and quiet, waiting for enough money to bring it to the surface. I thought of my grandfather then, unbidden the way I always thought of him at moments that mattered. I remembered sitting with him on the back porch the summer I turned 16, shelling peas into a chipped ceramic bowl, the cicadas loud in the pines behind the house. He'd looked at me sideways and said, apropos of nothing, Emily, never let anyone believe they have a claim on what's yours. Not because you're selfish, because the moment they believe it, they stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a resource. I hadn't understood it then. I understood it perfectly now, standing barefoot in a dark hallway, listening to my family discuss me like an asset line in a spreadsheet. I didn't confront them that morning. I went back upstairs dressed for the day and came down 20 minutes later acting as though I'd heard nothing. My mother kissed my cheek. My father asked if I'd slept well. Ashley showed me a bridesmaid dress swatch on her phone and asked if lavender was too much. I said it looked lovely. My voice didn't shake. I'd learned control the hard way in places far more dangerous than my parents' kitchen. But I watched now with different eyes. Over the following days, the pressure began subtle at first, then less so. My father brought up prenuptial agreements at dinner, phrased as concern for Daniel. You want to protect him too, Em. What if something happened to you? He'd need to be provided for properly, not tangled up in trusts and legalities. It was almost clever dressing the request in the language of caring for my fiancé. My mother's approach was softer, more emotional. She'd corner me in the kitchen while I was helping with dishes and say things like, I just want us to be one family with one future sweetheart, not separate accounts and separate lives. She had a talent for making boundaries sound like rejection, for making privacy sound like coldness. Daniel, for his part, had no idea any of this was happening. He knew my family was a little intense, his word, but he didn't know the shape of what was underneath. When my father mentioned the prenup idea at dinner one night, Daniel just shrugged and said he trusted whatever I thought was right, that he wasn't marrying me for anything but me. I remember looking at him across the table, this quiet, steady man who fixed broken things for a living, and thinking that he was the only person in that house who wanted nothing from me at all. I told him only, "Trust me, I'm handling something. I'll explain everything soon." He nodded the way he always did, without demanding more than I was ready to give. It was one of the things I loved most about him. His patience felt like the opposite of everyone else's hunger. Meanwhile, I started paying closer attention to my father's schedule. He'd started leaving the house on Tuesday afternoons, dressed a little too formally for errands, coming home with a manila folder he kept in his desk drawer. I recognized the drawer I used to hide report cards in it as a kid. Now apparently it held something else. One evening, while helping my mother set the table, I asked casually where Dad had been. She hesitated for half a second too long before saying, "Oh, just a meeting, business things." I let it go, but I made a note of the date, the time, and the slight flush that crossed her face when she lied to me. I didn't know yet exactly what my father was planning with that folder or which lawyer he'd been seeing, but I knew enough. I knew that the family I'd spent 29 years trying to please had already decided somewhere in a quiet, calculated corner of themselves that my inheritance belonged to all of them, and that my job in their eyes was simply to be convinced of that fact before I signed anything binding. I closed my eyes that night beside Daniel, listening to his breathing even out into sleep, and made a decision. I wasn't going to confront them yet. I was going to watch. I was going to learn exactly how far they were willing to go. The days that followed had a strange, suspended quality to them, like the calm you feel in the field right before you know something is about to break. I went through the motions of wedding planning, tasting cakes I could barely swallow, approving seating charts, smiling for photographers who came to scout the venue. But underneath all of it, I was running a quiet operation of my own. I called Patricia, my lawyer friend, on a Thursday evening, while Daniel was at his weekly poker game with the guys from his firm. I gave her the name of the attorney my father had been meeting. I'd found it on a business card tucked in his desk drawer, right next to the manila folder I'd been watching for 2 weeks. Patricia went quiet on the phone for a moment, and then she said, "Emily, that guy specializes in exactly one thing: helping families restructure assets around a new marriage, getting spouses to sign over rights they don't know they're signing away." I sat on the edge of my bed, phone pressed to my ear, and felt something in my chest go cold and very calm at the same time. "So he's not helping my dad with a business deal?" "No," Patricia said gently. "He's helping your dad figure out how to get access to your money through Daniel." I thanked her, hung up, and sat there in the dark for a long time. I wasn't surprised anymore. I was gathering evidence now, piece by piece, the way I'd been trained to build a case out of fragments that meant nothing alone but everything together. 2 days later, Ashley showed up at my apartment, unannounced, mascara already smudged before she'd said a word. She sat on my couch, twisting a tissue in her hands, and told me she was drowning credit card debt, a car payment behind a landlord threatening eviction. Her voice cracked in all the right places. "I don't know who else to ask, Em. You're my sister. I know things have been weird, but that's just family, isn't it? We fight, we make up." She looked up at me with wet eyes and said the number $1 million. "Not a loan," she clarified. "A gift. You have so much, it wouldn't even make a dent." I watched her carefully while she cried, and I noticed something I'd missed my whole life: the way her eyes flicked toward me between sobs, checking to see if the performance was landing. It was the same thing I'd seen in interrogation training videos, actually the tell of someone monitoring their audience's reaction instead of being lost in their own emotion. I told her no gently but clearly. I said I loved her, that I wanted to help her get back on her feet in a real way, a budget, a plan, maybe a loan with actual terms, but that I wasn't going to hand over $1 million because she asked while crying on my couch. The tears stopped almost instantly. Her face hardened into something I recognized from childhood, the look she used to get right before she'd tell our parents I'd broken something I hadn't touched. "Wow," she said. "So the money really did change you?" "No," I said quietly. "It just showed me who was waiting for it." She left without saying goodbye. That night my mother called, her voice thick with disappointment, before I'd even said hello. "Ashley's devastated, Emily. She says you turned your back on her." I tried to explain my reasoning, but my mother cut through it with the phrase she always used to end arguments in our house: Family helps family. That's what we do. My father got on the phone a few minutes later and said something similar, dressed in more formal language, about how a family's wealth was meant to lift everyone, not just the person who happened to inherit it. "Your grandfather would want us all taken care of," he said, and something about hearing my grandfather's memory used as a lever made my hands shake with quiet fury. I didn't argue. I said I needed time to think, and I hung up. It was around this time that Daniel finally learned the truth, not from me, but from an offhand comment my mother made at a dinner she'd insisted on hosting to bring the families together. She mentioned almost casually over the pot roast the value of my grandfather's business at the time of his passing. Daniel's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. I watched the number land on him, watched him do the math in real time, watched his face shift from confusion to something like disbelief. He didn't say anything until we were in the car afterward. He sat in the passenger seat, hands in his lap, and finally said, "Is that true? What your mom said?" I nodded, watching the road, waiting for the moment I'd been dreading for 2 years, the moment money entered the relationship and changed the shape of it. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he reached over and took my hand off the steering wheel at the next red light, held it in both of his, and said, "Okay, that's a lot, but it doesn't change anything. I asked you to marry you, Emily, not a number." I felt tears come up hot and fast, and I had to pull the car over on a side street because I couldn't see through them. He didn't ask why I hadn't told him sooner. He just held my hand and let me cry until I was ready to drive again. That night, lying awake next to him, I made a decision I'd been circling for days. If my family was going to keep pushing, keep manipulating, keep trying to dress their greed up as love, I needed more than my own memory of overheard conversations. I needed proof, something undeniable, something that couldn't be explained away at Thanksgiving as just a misunderstanding. The next morning, I bought a small digital recorder, the kind Patricia had recommended years ago, for exactly this kind of situation, legal in my state, as long as I was a party to the conversation. I started carrying it in my bag every time I saw my parents or Ashley. I told myself I was just documenting, just protecting myself. But some part of me knew I was building something more than a defense. I was building the moment I would finally show them exactly who they'd been talking to in that kitchen. The recorder became a quiet companion in the weeks that followed, tucked into the inside pocket of my bag every time I walked into my parents' house. I want to be honest about how strange that felt, recording my own mother's voice, my own father's, my own sister's, the way you'd document a stranger. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I was becoming someone cold, someone who saw evidence where there should have been trust. But then I'd remember the kitchen, the whispered plans. The word resource my grandfather had warned me about years before it applied to me, and the doubt would settle back into resolve. I didn't have to wait long for more material. My family, emboldened by what they must have read as my silence, stopped being careful. At a Sunday lunch, Ashley cornered me in the kitchen while pretending to help with dishes, the recorder sitting quietly in my bag on the counter beside us. "Look," she said, voice low so our parents wouldn't hear, "here's what I think we should do. After the wedding, once you and Daniel are official, we just need you to add him to a joint account. Something reasonable sounding. Then it's not you giving up control, it's just marriage stuff. Normal marriage stuff." She said it like she was doing me a favor, handing me a clever solution to a problem I hadn't known I had. "And if I don't want to?" I asked, drying a plate, slowly watching her reflection in the dark kitchen window. "Then we might have to remind you what you owe this family," she said, and there was an edge under the words that hadn't been there in earlier conversations. "Mom and Dad raised you. Grandma and Grandpa didn't do that alone, you know. Everyone contributed to who you became. That money isn't just yours because your name's on it." I said nothing. I just kept drying the plate, feeling the recorder's small weight in my bag like a held breath. My mother's contributions to the campaign were subtler, and in some ways more unsettling. A week later, she called me crying, saying her blood pressure had spiked, that the doctor was concerned that my distance was making her sick. "I just don't understand why you're punishing us like this," she said between sobs. "Haven't I done enough? Don't I deserve to be taken care of in my old age?" When I offered to come sit with her to take her to a doctor's appointment myself, she suddenly felt better, her voice brightening within minutes. I recognized the pattern by then. I'd started keeping a private list in my phone's notes app dates and behaviors, watching the same performance repeat with small variations like a play running slightly different each night. My father's approach remained the most direct, and in some ways the most honest because at least he didn't pretend it was about love. He asked me outright over coffee one Saturday morning whether I'd consider adding him as a co-signer on just the operating accounts, nothing major, so he could help manage things once I was married, and presumably too busy with a new husband to handle my own finances. When I asked why he thought I needed help managing money I'd handled competently for years, he said something that stuck with me long after. "Because it's not just your money anymore, Emily. Not really. It never was." That sentence sat with me for days. It never was. As if my grandparents' trust in me, their decision to leave everything to the one grandchild who'd actually shown up for them, meant nothing next to my father's belief that blood alone entitled him to access. Daniel watched all of this unfold with a growing tightness around his eyes that I hadn't seen in him before. He wasn't a confrontational man by nature, but one night after my mother's third tearful phone call that week, he sat across from me at our kitchen table and said quietly, "We could just cancel it, the wedding. Elope somewhere quiet, just the two of us, and let this all blow over without giving them a stage to perform on." Part of me wanted exactly that. But another part of me, the part shaped by years of training that told me retreat sometimes costs you more than confrontation, knew that running wouldn't end anything. It would just delay the reckoning. Let them believe they'd won something by scaring me off, and leave the truth buried where it could fester and repeat itself with the next milestone in my life. A house, a child, another chance for them to circle back with new justifications. "No," I told him, reaching across the table for his hand. "I don't want to hide from this. I want it to end, completely, on my terms." He studied my face for a long moment, then nodded the way he always did when he trusted me, even without fully understanding the plan yet. That week, the trust documents finalized weeks earlier sat in a fireproof safe in Patricia's office, untouchable, ironclad, exactly as I'd built them. The recordings on my device had grown into a small, damning archive, Ashley's calculated plan for the joint account, my mother's manufactured tears, my father's blunt admission that he believed the money had never really been mine. Patricia had reviewed each file with the careful, unemotional eye of a professional, confirming that everything was legally recorded and admissible if it ever came to that. I didn't want it to come to that. Not really. Some stubborn, hopeful piece of me still wanted my parents to surprise me, to come to their senses, to apologize, to simply stop. So I decided to give them one last chance in the open, where nothing could be denied or reframed later. I picked up my phone and called my mother. "I want to have everyone over for dinner," I said. "Before the wedding. Just us. Family." There was a pause on the other end, and then my mother's voice brightened instantly, warm and eager in a way that made my stomach turn, even as I kept my own voice steady. "Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful. We'd love that." I hung up and sat very still for a moment, looking at the recorder charging quietly on my nightstand, and felt the particular calm that comes right before you commit to something you can't take back. The dinner was set for a Saturday evening 1 week before the wedding, and I chose to host it at my own apartment rather than my parents' house. I wanted the ground to be mine this time. I spent the afternoon cooking, of all things, a pot roast, the same dish my mother had used weeks earlier to casually reveal my inheritance to Daniel. There was a certain symmetry to it that felt necessary, though I couldn't have explained why to anyone watching me chop carrots with unusual precision that afternoon. Daniel offered to stay, but I asked him to be there from the start. This wasn't something I wanted to shield him from anymore. He'd earned the right to see the whole picture, not just the aftermath. My parents arrived first, my father in a pressed shirt that suggested he considered this occasion important in some transactional sense, my mother carrying a bottle of wine and an expression of practiced warmth. Ashley came 15 minutes later, scrolling through her phone as she walked in, barely looking up to say hello. I noted quietly that none of them asked how I was doing, how the wedding planning was going, how I was feeling 1 week before one of the biggest days of my life. The conversation, once we sat down, drifted almost immediately toward money, my father mentioning again the idea of joint accounts for practical reasons. my mother nodding along as though this were the most natural topic in the world for a family dinner. I let them talk. I ate slowly, methodically, the way I'd learned to eat during long deployments when meals were unpredictable, and you took what nourishment you could get while you could get it. Daniel sat beside me, quiet, his hand occasionally finding mine under the table, a small anchor. When my father finally asked directly, "So, Emily, have you thought more about what we discussed about adding Richard, or really any of us, to help manage things once you're married?" I set down my fork and looked at him steadily. "I have thought about it," I said. "A lot, actually." His face brightened, the practiced warmth of victory already forming at the corners of his mouth. My mother reached for my hand across the table, tears already gathering, the same performance I'd watched dozens of times now, except this time I understood exactly how rehearsed it was. "I knew you'd come around," Ashley said, smiling for the first time all evening, already reaching for her wine glass as though we were toasting something. I let the silence stretch for a moment, long enough that Daniel shifted slightly beside me, sensing what was coming. "I did make a decision," I said. "About a week before the wedding, actually. I moved everything, every account, every property, every share of stock into an irrevocable trust. Sole beneficiary me, no joint access, no co-signers, nobody else's name on anything ever." The table went quiet in a way I'll remember for the rest of my life. My father's face didn't move for a long moment, as though his mind was still processing the sentence and hadn't yet delivered it to the rest of his features. My mother's hand, still holding mine, went rigid, and then withdrew slowly like she'd touched something hot. Ashley was the first to break. "You did what—" I protected what my grandparents left me. I said, my voice steady, calm, the voice I used to give orders in the field when panic was not an option. "Because I heard you, all three of you, in the kitchen the morning after I signed the papers. I heard you talking about how to get Daniel to sign something about how you'd convince me it was just normal marriage stuff. I heard every word." My father's face went through several colors in quick succession. "You were spying on us. I was standing in a hallway in my own childhood home," I said. "You were the ones planning behind my back." Ashley slammed her wine glass down hard enough that it sloshed onto the tablecloth. "This is insane. This is family money. Grandma and Grandpa would want it shared. You've always been selfish, Emily, ever since you were a kid running off to play soldier while the rest of us actually stayed and built relationships in this family. I have every conversation recorded," I said quietly, and reached into my bag for the small device I'd carried for weeks, setting it on the table between the wine glasses and the pot roast. Every plan, every threat, every performance. The color drained from my mother's face entirely. "Emily, you wouldn't—" "I already have," I said. "It's with my attorney, along with copies of the trust documents which for the record are completely legal and completely unbreakable. There's no version of this where any of you gain access to that money. Not through Daniel, not through a joint account, not through guilt or tears or reminding me what I supposedly owe you." My father stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. "You ungrateful," he started, and then seemed to catch himself, some old instinct for control reasserting itself even in the wreckage of the moment. "We're your family, Emily. This is how families work." "No," I said, and for the first time in the conversation my voice cracked just slightly, the only sign of how much this was costing me. "Families don't plot against each other in kitchens at 6 in the morning. Families don't send their daughter to cry on a couch as a negotiating tactic. Families don't use their own mother's chest pains as leverage." I looked at my mother as I said it, and watched her flinch, the mask slipping for just a second before she rearranged it into wounded indignation. Ashley stood up too, grabbing her purse. "You'll regret this. When you need us and you will, don't come crawling back." "I won't," I said simply. Daniel stood then quietly, and came around the table to stand beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder. Not dramatic, not performative, just present. It was such a small gesture, and it meant more to me in that moment than anything my family had ever offered me. My father grabbed his coat. My mother lingered by the door for a moment, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between fury and maybe for just a flicker, something like recognition of what she'd actually done. Then she turned and left too, the door clicking shut behind the three of them. The apartment went very quiet. Daniel sat back down beside me and I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for a month. "You okay?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "Ask me tomorrow." The days after that dinner moved faster than I expected grief and conflict to move. I'd braced myself for a long, drawn-out war. Instead, what came was a strange clipped efficiency, as if my family, having lost the element of surprise, didn't quite know how to fight a battle they could no longer win quietly. My father called Patricia's office 2 days later, demanding to speak to whoever was responsible for the trust, using the tone he used to use with vendors who'd shipped a bad order. Patricia took the call herself. She told me about it afterward, her voice carrying the particular patience of someone who has explained the same legal reality many times before to people who don't want to hear it. She walked him through it plainly. The trust was irrevocable, properly executed, witnessed, and notarized weeks before the wedding with no undue influence, no coercion, no gray area a lawyer could exploit. There was, she told him, nothing to contest. No court in the country would unwind it based on hurt feelings and a sense of entitlement. He threatened to sue anyway. Patricia let him. 2 weeks later, the attorney he'd hired, the same one who specialized in exactly this kind of maneuvering, sent a polite letter declining to pursue the matter further, citing insufficient legal grounds. I imagine that conversation between my father and that attorney was not a pleasant one. I never asked for details. I didn't need them. Ashley's unraveling was quieter in its way, though no less complete. Without my money to bail her out, the debts she'd mentioned crying on my couch caught up with her fully within a couple of months. She lost the lease on her apartment. I heard through my mother filtered secondhand, and clearly meant to guilt me that Ashley had moved into a small rented room above a family friend's garage. I felt something complicated when I heard that, not satisfaction exactly, and not the relief I might have expected either. Mostly I felt tired, the specific exhaustion of watching a person choose the same destructive pattern again and again, and refuse every off-ramp offered to them, including the one where a real conversation with me, an honest one, might have led somewhere different. My mother called constantly at first. I let most of the calls go to voicemail. The messages followed a familiar arc anger, then wounded sadness, then a strange brittle cheerfulness, as if pretending nothing had happened might make it true. I didn't return most of them. When I did pick up twice, the conversations went in circles, always arriving back at the same accusation that I'd humiliated the family, that recording them had been a betrayal worse than anything they'd done, that a real daughter wouldn't have let it come to this. I stopped trying to explain myself after the second call. Some people will never see the shape of what they did, no matter how clearly you hold up the mirror. Daniel and I got married 8 days after that dinner, exactly on schedule. It was smaller than we'd originally planned. We cut the guest list by half quietly without announcement, and neither of us mourned the change. My parents weren't invited. Ashley wasn't invited. In their place stood people who had actually shown up for me over the years, 2 women from my unit who'd flown in on short notice, Patricia and her husband Daniel's parents, who welcomed me with an ease and warmth that made me realize for the first time what unconditional actually looked like in practice rather than in theory. We got married in a small garden venue outside the city, string lights instead of chandeliers, 50 chairs instead of 200. My grandmother's old wedding ring, the one item from her estate I'd kept outside the trust, because it wasn't about money, sat on my finger the entire ceremony. I thought about her and my grandfather more than once that day, wondering if they'd have been proud of the decision I'd made, and somewhere in my chest I believed they would have been. Daniel cried during his vows, which surprised both of us. He said something I've held on to since, that he'd learned over the past month, that love without conditions is rarer than people think, and that watching me protect myself hadn't made him love me less, it had shown him exactly who he was marrying. I cried too, obviously, standing there in a dress I'd chosen without a single opinion from my mother, surrounded by people who wanted nothing from me but my company. In the weeks that followed the wedding, I went back to my unit, back to the rhythm of a life that had structure and purpose, independent of any of this. Daniel started the process of opening his own small engineering consultancy, something we'd talked about for years, and finally had the stability, ironically, to pursue. My father never called. Not once, not to apologize, not even to acknowledge what had happened. I think in his mind the entire event was something that had been done to him rather than something he'd caused. Ashley's silence lasted about 3 months before an occasional guilt-laden text would appear, asking for nothing directly but circling the subject with careful, transparent hints. I didn't respond to those either. My mother reached out the most in fits and starts, never quite apologizing, always finding some way to reframe the story, so that I bore equal blame for a rupture she and my father and sister had engineered entirely on their own. I let those calls go unanswered too, not out of cruelty, but because I'd learned finally and completely the difference between a relationship and a transaction wearing a family's face. One evening, a few weeks after the wedding, Daniel asked me if I had any regrets. I thought about it honestly before answering. Yes, I told him. Not about protecting myself. Never that. I regret that it took hearing them plan against me in a kitchen to finally see who they really were. I spent 29 years hoping I was wrong about the distance I always felt in that house. Turns out I wasn't imagining it at all. He didn't try to fix that feeling or talk me out of it. He just held my hand the way he always did, and let the truth sit there between us, finally spoken out loud instead of buried under decades of performance. A year had passed since that dinner, where I set a small recorder down between the wine glasses and watched my family's carefully constructed image of themselves collapse in real time. A year since the wedding with 50 chairs instead of 200. A year of learning what quiet actually felt like after a lifetime of mistaking noise for closeness. Daniel and I settled into a rhythm that surprised me with its ordinariness. I stayed in the Army, still moving through deployments and training cycles with the same discipline that had shaped me since I was 18. Daniel's consultancy grew slowly but steadily, one contract leading to another. His reputation built the same way he built everything, carefully, honestly, without shortcuts. We bought a house together that spring, nothing extravagant. A modest place with good bones and a porch that reminded me in the best way of my grandparents' back steps. The trust remained exactly as I'd built it, untouched, unchallenged, doing precisely what it was designed to do. But money that sits idle has never interested me much. So Daniel and I sat down one evening with Patricia and talked about what we actually wanted that money to do in the world, beyond simply existing as a wall between me and people who wanted access to it. We started small. A scholarship fund for children of deployed service members named quietly after my grandparents, the kind of gift that doesn't ask for gratitude or attention. Contributions to a veterans transition program that helped soldiers find footing in civilian life, something I understood in my bones from watching friends struggle with exactly that after their own service ended. And a modest but growing fund supporting foster children aging out of the system with no family safety net behind them, the kind of safety net I'd learned painfully isn't guaranteed by blood alone. It felt right using what my grandparents built to support people who needed exactly what they'd given me, a chance, and someone who believed they deserved it. My father never called. Not on my birthday, not on the anniversary of the wedding, not once in 12 full months. I used to imagine in weaker moments some version of him lying awake, working up the courage to apologize. I don't imagine that anymore. I think honestly he still believes the story where I wronged him, and some doors don't open just because you leave the light on. Ashley resurfaced twice that year, each time through a text that circled her actual need, without ever naming it directly, a mention of a job that just didn't work out, a comment about how hard things had been since everyone abandoned her. I didn't respond to either message. Not out of anger anymore, mostly. Just clarity. I'd spent enough of my life mistaking her performances for pain that was actually mine to fix. My mother tried the hardest in her own way to find a path back. Not with apology, not really, but with softer and softer versions of the same old story, testing which one might finally land. I met her for coffee once about 10 months after the wedding because some part of me still wanted to believe she might surprise me. We sat across from each other in a small cafe, and I finally said the only thing I had left to offer her. "If you come to me because you want me, Mom, my door is always open. If you come because you want what's in that trust, there's nothing left to say." She didn't answer right away. She just looked at her coffee for a long moment, and something in her face shifted briefly into something that looked almost like recognition. I don't know if it lasted past that afternoon. I haven't heard from her since. I used to think losing my family over money would feel like the worst thing that ever happened to me. Instead, what I lost was smaller and stranger than that I lost the illusion that we were ever the family I'd spent my whole life trying to convince myself we were. What I gained in its place was harder to measure, but far more real: a husband who loved me before he knew what I was worth. A handful of people who showed up without being asked, and a peace that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval to exist. My grandfather used to say that money doesn't build character, it reveals it. I understand now fully what he meant. The trust I built 1 week before my wedding didn't destroy my family. It simply showed me with unbearable clarity exactly who they'd been all along. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever had to protect your own peace from people who were supposed to protect you instead, I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what part of Emily's story stayed with you. Leave a comment below and tell me. We have so many more stories like this one waiting to be told, so make sure you subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep this journey going together.